they liked it. You know, this gentleman right here in kind of the yellow, he's seen it 11 times.
Thank you.
On our last film, it was usually 14-year-old girls that had seen it 11 So something's different on this one.
Well, you know, sound is the most fascinating part of movie making. I think the most misunderstood part, certainly for laymen. And you know, a lot of times I get the feeling that in the Academy Awards, people that vote that aren't in the sound branch sort of vote for what they think is the loudest movie or something like that. They don't really understand it. So it's always interesting to talk to the sound magicians, as I call you guys, and find out the real art here. And this movie was different in that it was different in a lot of ways for a lot of the crafts. You worked on this wasn't just a post-production job. Did you, Christopher, you started on this much earlier than that?
I started in 2006 in December, making sounds for the Banshees. So it was quite a long time ago.
How is that different from the other projects you've done? Can you talk about?
It's different by about 2 years, typically. I mean, because I often sound design and mix a film, I'm on quite a bit longer than a lot of people might be. I'm sort of through the entire swath, but on this film, Jim had a plan, and he laid it out to me early in mid-2006, and so I knew I had a huge challenge on my hands, and Jon basically, you know, gave me my marching orders, and you know, I had a great crew. I had a fellow who moved down here from the Bay Area, Addison Teague, and he set up shop at Jim's place out in Malibu, and so we were on it for a long time. I would go on for 2-3 weeks, come off, then come back on, and Addison stayed on throughout the whole process, and then, you know, in the last year or so, it was pretty much 24/7 for me.
Jon, why those marching orders?
Well, as I say, you know, why is, you know, as Jim edits, and Jim is an editor, a very hands-on editor, he works with sound. It's important for him to have the sound and to have something to work with and to design these. What is the voice of the Banshee? What is the voice of the Thanator? It was important for our editorial process. You see the final result, but in the little behind-the-scenes clip we showed you what we called the template version, which is what I call the 1990s video game looking version. Well, we edited the movie that whole way before we turned over sequences to Weta Digital to work on. And Jim couldn't make those decisions, and our other editors who Jim worked with, without having the sound to work with.
Okay, Jim,
When did we
talk about that.
Let me just ask Jon, do you remember when we turned in our first sort of final cut scene?
February of 2007.
Yeah.
That was we gave Weta 1 minute and 17 seconds of the film at the template level, and Jim talks about, you know, the pressure that we felt going through for like 3 years was we didn't have any final product back, and we were sitting there saying, you know, we believe it's going to be finished. We had done a prototype, but we hadn't seen any finished shots back from Weta for another 14 months after we turned it over, and we went in and saw the first scene. And it was like, okay, this might work, but we have 1,900 other shots to go.
Why did you want to work in this particular manner on this film with all of this that's normally done at a different time?
Well, I mean, you know, you always jokingly say that this film combined all of the negatives of an animation film and all the negatives of a live-action film. You know, so you know, we in the CG sequences we use this template methodology to avoid some of the processes of an animated movie, simply because I wasn't familiar with those, and we created a director-centric workflow so that I could do the virtual cameras, edit them, and then give it to Weta, and they would have a very precise guideline for what the shots would be. And to give you an idea of how precise, the cameras that we created in our little in-house facility here in LA were the final cameras. Weta never changed the camera moves. The CG camera moves didn't change. They were pixel accurate cameras, and every asset within the frame was accurate spatially where it was, and it was the final performances of the actors, but it was all at a relatively low resolution, so it could run in real time. So it essentially could run on this kind of game engine like render engine. So when we gave it to them, they then moved out of our sort of proxy resolution, put in these really high polygon count assets, and then sent it back to us like anywhere from 18 months to a year. Eventually, it got down to about 9 months. Later was the turnaround time from the time we gave it to them to the time we saw, what they proposed as finished shots, which really was just a departure point for starting to iterate toward finished shots. How this all relates to sound is because the template was frame accurate. We never changed the cut, other than a few very minor instances. It was frame accurate, and it was accurate compositionally. In theory, we could final mix the movie to the template. At least that was my fantasy. Although I think we found that
They're laughing down there.
well, yeah,
He's laughing.
no, yeah, but
not
you
laughing.
want to speak to that? Do you want to speak to what what we could do at a template level and then beyond?
I mean, for me, for the sound, we were final mixing sound effects that, they changed subtly once we got dialogue and music to really work against. But I would take rough dialogue and temp music and work to that a good year before we hit the dub stage in a Pro Tools environment. I would mix it on the console, bring it back into the Pro Tools, so that we could continually be, backing up Jim. Jim has this incredible ability to cut sound in addition to everything else he does. So he would we would sort of supply him with a library, and he would pick things that he'd like. And that would be sort of, in a way, our pathway, our far more intricate than any kind of spotting session. He would give us really sometimes very distinct sounds that he wanted to use so that we would understand the intent behind what he was doing with the sound. And we started building those little blocks, not reels, but literally small scenes. A good solid year, we had some stuff that changed very little to what you see on the screen now a year prior to release.
Well, it was
It
also
was really cool because Chris, Chris would generate these sounds, in his wacky sound designer lab, and all of these weird screeches and vocalizations, and we'd have these long conversations about, okay, what is the psychology of the banshee? What are its different vocalizations? It doesn't just make one sound; it has all these different sounds. And so we'd come up with a kind of a sound vocabulary for the banshee, depending on its kind of mood state, whether it was agitated or calm or aggressive, attacking, and all that. And so Chris would supply us with all these sounds, and then I would cut them against picture and change the picture sometimes. Because for me, having the sounds available when you're cutting picture actually influences how you cut the picture to some extent. And so, it was an early feedback loop, and it was really great having Chris's sounds, and then Addison, Chris mentioned Addison, right in-house with us. And if Chris was on another movie, because he did probably like 3 other films during the
2 or 3, yeah.
Yeah. And,
Short ones.
Yeah, and so Addison was our continuous representative, and then Chris would drop in, in between his other projects and kind of goose it up and create new stuff. And, so it was really this kind of ongoing creative feedback loop over a period of time.
What's the difference when you're doing sound for 3D? When you're doing 3D, is there a big difference in creating the sound and that sort of thing, Gary, or,
In creating sound for 3D?
Yeah, 3D. Is there something that you're thinking of that you normally wouldn't do?
I don't think there was much different. I think that one thing that we did do was we would mix the film in 2D over in the theater, and then we would go upstairs where Jim had the visual effects, and we would watch the reel with Jim in 3D. And we would sit very close to the screen, so we would really see the 3D effects. And Jim, with no sound, we were playing it silent, and Jim would spot the specific things that really came off the screen to make sure that in the mix, we augmented that or made sure that, those sounds were clear and that it would really, key the audience into that 3D effect. But I mixed the dialogue, and there wasn't a lot of things that were different with 3D, I don't think, dialogue-wise.
Sound's been in 3D since 5.0.
Oh, yeah. It's all
so really
around
it's
you already,
picture
yeah.
catching up with sound.
Right.
The sound didn't really have to do anything differently because it's been spatial the whole time. Although we did that experiment of sitting and watching the reel silent and just seeing spatially where things were moving, so we'd remember them because we were mixing in 2D, but it was really more just kind of heightening your awareness of where things were and where you got a sense of something coming past you. Like maybe, you know, there were some fast tracers coming at you, but you were less aware in 2D of where, specifically where they were going over your right shoulder, things like that. And then we took the memory of that into the mix.
What's the most, go ahead.
I was going to say one thing that I felt with the music particularly, which was my responsibility during the mix, was that I felt that when I put the 3D glasses on, the music had, for some reason, an effect of staying more on the screen. So I purposely started by trying to just pull it slightly more from the screen, probably say 10 to 20% out from the screen in terms of string sounds, particularly with the shakuhachi flutes and things, to try and hover them out into the room a little bit more. Just, it's not very noticeable, but it just seemed to give a slightly more sort of immersive effect through the film. And I found that was just, for some reason, putting the glasses on, it flattened it down musically, and I just did that starting from day one, and you know, I was pleased with
We
that
had that
result.
experience in this very theater.
Yeah.
We came down and screened 2-3 reels at a time. Yeah.
Can you talk about working with the music, with James Horner's score here and that process?
Yes, it was. The process with James and Jim went back a long way, and obviously because of the way Jim cuts and works with his sound effects, and definitely works with the temp music, is you know, he creates this storytelling flow musically through the film that James Horner and Jim would then collaborate, and James would come up with a different approach, and Jim would adjust it back, and there would be a lot of toing and froing until it was ready to go in front of the orchestra. And then when it went in front of the orchestra, Simon Rhodes, who's a brilliant scoring engineer that works with James, purposely kept every single thing separate for me, so that I had a very big music layout, but it allowed me tremendous flexibility, particularly with things like percussion, because I knew it would tangle up, and Jim certainly knew it would tangle up quickly. So I had to have all the flexibility in front of me, and it was a terrific experience, because at any point we could just shut something down, which is not untypical within a mix, but I'd say this was wider than any mix I've ever experienced, and it paid off many, many times, because it allowed also for editorial process to go forward and allow them to make adjustments that didn't impact, you know, they could take the percussion and cut it slightly differently to the orchestra. And so for me, it was a tremendously flexible experience, which I think
James
paid
likes
off.
to do very layered music.
Very
He
layered.
likes the music to have a full life on its own. And sometimes some of those layers create too much complexity when Chris's stuff starts to get layered in with
Absolutely.
it. And James basically built us a kit in terms of separate tracks, so that we could pull things out that were muddying, because sometimes it would be a certain specific thing, whether it was percussion or maybe it was a synth vocal or a live vocal that was muddying up with something that Chris was doing, and it gave us the option to play one against the other.
The dialogue, I think, in this film is very important. And so, Gary, when you're mixing that dialogue with all of these elements here, how is that done to make sure that you can hear every line, and even the worst sound systems in the middle of the country somewhere in some horrible theater?
Well,
Yeah.
well, I mean, that was one thing Jim always wanted. Was he was very focused on the narrative of the film. We have to hear the characters. You know, we can't lose, you know, if you look at the Thanator sequence, I remember we were mixing that, and it's when Jake starts being chased by the Thanator through the jungle, and the Thanator screaming, the music's pounding and everything, and you hear Jake breathing the whole time as he runs. And we would get in the mix, and we're trying to make it dynamic and big and everything, and Jim stops and says, "I'm losing my character. I can't hear him breathing." And, you know, and the way Jim would explain it was, if I can't hear the main character and the threat to him and his panic, then it's just a big monster scene. It's not about the character. And so Jim always focused on that in the film was, I want to hear the characters, I want to hear the narrative of the film. And so that was sort of my job, and of course, these guys working with me to make sure that that was always very clear.
It was great working with Gary, because we go back to Terminator 2. It's like, I don't even want to say how long that is.
When you talk about characters, and from Chris's perspective, you know, this movie is really all about story. I mean, people think it's about 3D, think it's about technology. It's not. It's about story. And interestingly enough, one of the characters in the story is the planet itself. And Chris in sound plays a big part of layering in and creating that character to immerse the audience into the world.
To create that world of Pandora and everything else with the
Yeah,
songs.
that was one of the early things that I thought about. I mean, when they brought me down to Lightstorm and John locked me in his office so I could read the script. And luckily for me, I took copious
Literally.
notes because they did literally lock me in. And 4 hours later, I had a lot of notes because Jim writes the script with emotional words that describe sound. But one of the first things I thought of, and one of the first things I said to Jim is, I want to record jungles all over the world. And oddly enough, I mean, I've done a couple of jungle films, and what I found was that you have to be very careful because it's the masking effect. I mean, you have to, it's almost like an orchestra, jungle sounds. One or two elements too many and you break it. And so we had to sort of, find that fine dance. But one of the things I was going to say in addition for me, because I've worked on a lot of big movies, and one of the things that Avatar did for me in my chair, which is can be the chair where everybody goes, "Oh boy, that was really loud," but oftentimes it's the music that I have to work my sounds to feed the story, no matter what the music's doing. Oftentimes that means getting rid of all of my sounds. But in Avatar, I was so happy that the music, thank you to Jim and Andy and James Horner, never got so thick or loud that I was in a position of having to feel like I was pushing too hard. And that seems like a simple thing, but man, I'm telling you, it's not.
Part of it is encouraging James to think about the sound design as he's scoring and as he's choosing, sometimes the long string lines. Well, I think the battle in Reel 9 is a really good example.
Oh, that was just a lot of fun for us.
But we knew we were going into a train wreck there where it was just one machine gun and turbine helicopter after another. So, we encouraged James to find a musical voice for some of the sequences that would be compatible with the effects by going with long string phrases that had long kind of sustainy structure instead of fast rhythmic stuff that was changing up where the ear could lose the pattern, because it was really about creating long lines and long patterns in there. And then that allowed you to be very percussive with the guns and the servos and all that hard stuff.
And one of the really fun things is that James got really into it with us, and he, being an acrobatic pilot himself, he started to really love the sound effects as well. And
I never saw him sit at a mix before. No. I mean, I that was a revelation. He got so into it, he just came and parked at the mix, and I thought, oh.
those were long
Now
hours,
he's
too.
going to be fighting for his music every second, and he wasn't. He was just taking it in, I think at that point he was so emotionally committed to the film, he just wanted to be there and see how the decisions were being made, probably to up his game on the next movie, whatever his next movie is.
You talk about James being there. I think one of the really interesting things for the whole crew that we had on this movie was the commitment and the passion that they had for the story we were telling. And they were there whether we needed them to be there, whether it's the visual effects artists, whether it's the sound crew or post-production crew. They were there with us the whole way, believing in the story and what the movie was about.
You've created this whole language for this film, the Na'vi language. So when you're doing ADR and that whole thing, is that easier because it's not like matching, actual the English language or anything?
Well, most of the Na'vi is spoken in the CG world. And we found an interesting thing that we were a little concerned about matching sync in ADR to CG, because we were a step removed from what the actor had originally done. So we actually took the CG out of the loop, and we had the actors ADR to the. You saw in the little clip how we were shooting reference footage of them in close up with HD, and that reference footage was used as a guide for what the finished animation looked like. When we put it in the split screen, the shot that was what Zoe was really doing was HD reference. We would loop to that. It wasn't the right angle, it wasn't exactly the right camera position, but we could see the lips better, so we'd loop to that, because then our theory was the CG was based on that and the ADR was based on that. They would meet in the middle, and we were seldom wrong. It usually worked pretty well. Maybe we'd slip it a frame or something just by eye.
Was there a special challenge that you found in doing that stuff at all?
Not really any different than a conventional film.
Okay.
A lot of you talk about the Na'vi, a lot of it was production dialogue that was recorded, the actors did as they did the mocap stuff. So, and so it was really just, when you loop them, say it didn't work or they were gonna, there was a technical problem, whatever, it was the same as normal ADR, and it would match in with the production.
Yeah, but when I tell Gary to go to where she says "Where to allez-vous," he'd go, "What?"
Yeah, I never did learn Na'vi.
What?
Learn it.
You know, working with it for a month, you don't know Na'vi yet?
The original dialogue for the performance capture was actually recorded from a mic that was on the booms that they were wearing. The booms had both a video camera that photographed their face and a little microphone. Now, we didn't utilize that as well as we hope to in the future, but it did, that's where the recording came from.
Yeah, and every actor had a discrete mic. Normally you get a boom that's sort of got everybody together, and if you've got overlaps and the picture cut, screws up that overlap, then you got to go back and you got to loop it to separate the tracks. But we had pretty separate tracks. A little bleed, but you could usually live with it. And I think that saved us a lot of looping, because the actors were all discreetly mic'd, and then in the cutting process we had them all as on separate tracks. So as we moved characters around temporally in the cut, we could slip the tracks relative to each other, and it worked pretty well.
You asked about the Na'vi language, and it's interesting in talking to the cast, and Zoe in particular, about what were the challenges of the performance. For her, we let her be the standard of what the Na'vi should sound like. That she had to set the bar, because she had the most in Na'vi for the other cast to match to. That's right, but the hardest thing for her was doing the English with a Na'vi accent, and not making that sound like any other accent, but making it sound like Na'vi, and incorporating that into the sound of it.
Yeah, because the problem is you quickly go to it's sounding French or Italian or Japanese or something like that. There's some language somewhere on Earth that has generated an accent that we were familiar with. So, we had to come up with an accent that sounded specific to Na'vi, and that was actually more difficult than them learning the language.
It's amazing when you look at this, what the actors did in this movie is a really extraordinary acting. When people think, really, you should applaud that, because it's an incredible challenge that I think people are just beginning to realize when they see what performance capture is capable of, and all of that. Let's turn it over to the audience and see if they have some questions here for you. Yes, right back there. Did you leave all the effects tracks unmixed so you could change them?
Nothing was left unmixed. We came with premixes. Otherwise, we'd have had thousands of tracks. We did. Basically, we separated them in such a way that we knew if Jim said, I want less of this wind and more of that ambience, that we had the ability with any given category to pull back. And if we couldn't do that, then we would rebuild it on the stage at the time, as we needed, very quickly if we had to. But no, you just couldn't. That would be technically irresponsible.
During the performance capture, did you have any on-set audio to help them?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we didn't want to compromise the dialogue tracks too much, but there were a couple of scenes where they just needed something to react to. So we had a PA system, and we had a little mix board there, and we could feed some canned sounds in. There was even one point where we had a bunch of samples loaded to a keyboard. I can't remember exactly what it was, and I'd literally play stuff like Leonopteryx roars or helicopters or explosions and things like that to give them something to react to for timing, for cueing. And then typically we'd do a couple of takes without that, so that we could get some temp audio that we could use, and then we'd clean it all up in ADR. But when the Leonopteryx comes in and screeches, we'd give them that. Or when the home tree was falling, we'd give them this big roaring, thunderous. And we were deafening. And that we said, forget production audio. We'll loop it. We'll do some wild stuff. I always try to do wild stuff in the moment when the actor's in the headspace. It's just like boom. Let's just say the line. Play the moment, and they get surprisingly close. I'm not a huge fan of ADR in the sense that I find it a kind of a slightly cumbersome process. I always feel like the actor just saying the line in the kind of emotional headspace of the moment gets you a lot closer with. And Gwen's such a good dialogue editor that she was able to make stuff fit. In that one, we just cranked it to 11 and let the thunder of the tree scare everybody, because there was nothing there. There was nothing visually there for them to react to, but a big long aluminum pole with a red tennis ball on the end of it for the tree coming down.
Now, one of the sounds that we did live with for a while that we did record on the set was the dying viper wolf.
Our first AD actually stood in for the dying viper wolf for Zoe to have something to react to, and he kind of... and we liked the sound so much, we actually kept it. In fact, I think in the end...
It's in there.
We replaced... Yeah, he's in there.
It's in there, yeah. We tried to replace it, but it's in there. But it's in there in such a way that it works perfectly. It's integrated into the Viper.
Ag residuals, we'll have to get into them.
In that home tree, you have different levels of explosions and big sounds and things. What was the challenge in making that different as that goes on?
Huge. I mean, and that was one of our. That was a really tough reel. Reel 7 home tree collapse was. Jim had heard our early pass on that and said, no, you got it all wrong. I mean, we've all done movie explosions and we did our best shot at it, but if you don't understand the intent behind the story that Jim's trying to tell, then you can easily miss a step. And we had
to be fair, we didn't have time to spot that one. You just kind of plunged in on it.
But in the end, I was really proud of what we came up with. The initial explosions are big, boomy, basically fiery explosions, and then the subsequent explosions are these very percussive high efficiency HE explosions that I don't know. I mean, I think they work really well in terms of the fact they hit and they roll over you with a ferocity that we spent a lot of time on, and that was a huge.
Plus, we had to create a shape to. I mean, the reel is really interesting dynamically for how loud it gets, because you guys were practically bleeding from the ears when you were mixing that reel, and I could only come in and stay for like an hour, and I'd have to go out and do something else and come back. It was mixed over a period of 2 or 3 days, because we actually would reach a fatigue point where you just have to stop and come back and work it the next day. Yeah. But it has a dynamic build, because it starts with all these incendiary explosions, and we intentionally gave those a soft attack, relatively soft attack, and a long development, so that we could distinguish them from the HE rounds later. And then when you're on the ground experiencing the effect of the HE rounds, then there was also this shockwave effect. So there was the initial concussion of the explosion, and then a shockwave that went over you and into the surrounds and all that. And this, we basically, I think we almost kind of built that all on the stage.
Oh, yeah,
and
absolutely.
And it evolved, and then James changed the music at the last second, and we had to go back and remix the Fall of the Tree. And of course, it was better. What he had done was he had synth vocals in, and we got it working. But then when he brought in the live orchestra, we laid that track in, and all of a sudden it just had this richness, and you felt sort of the pain in the voices. Yeah,
the voices were extraordinary in the choir, because we'd been working with a synth choir, and we'd spent a long time balancing it through, and it felt great. The sequence was amazing. And then James said, I've just recorded the real choir. And it's like, oh no, we've got to go into that reel again. And I thought we were going to be unpicking our way through it, and I put the choir in, and I literally just played through, and we just went, oh my God, because it was humanity. It was the most amazing feel.
Emotion.
It just sailed right through, and I barely touched it. I mean, it was just.
It was a revelation to me, because the synth choir was great, and I was satisfied. It's like, yeah, that's perfect. That's all we need, And then the richness and intonation of the live choir made a huge difference.
The other thing you did, Jim, editorially, picture-wise, is you created a pause
Yeah, actually, John Rafua did that. In an early structuring of that scene visually, he was one of the other picture editors. It was John Rafua and Steve Rifkin, and John just did this thing where everybody looks up and the tree's not falling; it's just stopped, and there's this sort of eye of the hurricane. There's this equipoise, and then it slowly starts to fall. And he created that. That wasn't necessarily in the script, and it wasn't the way we shot it, particularly. And I think it's the most amazing moment in the whole reel, because everything just goes silent, and you just hear these leaves falling, and the music's not even doing anything, and then the music starts again once the tree decisively starts to move, and the music comes in with this big kind of downbeat that just says, "That's right, folks, big tragic shit is happening," and it's like from that moment what's going to happen, but you're forced to watch it play out.
It's about the emotion. I mean, that moment allows you to go from an action sequence into an emotional sequence. And I think why the movie works and why the sound works, it's all because you evoke emotion from the audience, and it's that does it for the reel.
For that sequence, I've been recording trees falling because I live out in rural area for years now, and Addison recorded a bunch as well. And so we brought a huge library to that scene. But I think, Jim, you spent quite a bit of time cutting the sound on that scene, and Addison and I listened to it and said, man, it's great. So we had this incredible template to build from and just really bring in small elements to sweeten here and there.
Thanks for that. But obviously, this was a very, very collaborative team effort, and they were feeding us these great tree crashes, and I'd slide them around to picture. And sometimes, what I learned from that was the way a tree fall develops, and it has an impact and a decay that you actually had to hold on shots longer. So having my position on this has always been, if you've got the sound, it actually impacts the picture cut. You wind up extending a shot by 20 frames or sometimes 60 frames, just because of the way the sound has to develop and decay.
Yeah, and we thank you for that, because that is our challenge all the time. I mean, we're always faced with, you want us to do what in how much time? And the toughest thing in the collapse for us was the final hit, to make sure that we didn't use up all the energy so that we couldn't finally bring this tree to rest in a powerful but emotional way. It was a tough sequence.
Amazing.
Yes, right back there, yeah. Okay, did sound lead the way, essentially, she's saying, for the creation of any of the, mythic creatures or anything like that? Was a sound the first thought in that?
Probably the viper wolf. The viper wolf pack hunting, for me, came from sitting writing the story. Well, because I live right at the edge of a state park. In Malibu, it's all state park behind me. I got a lot of coyotes, and to hear those guys out there pack hunting at night, and it's almost like an echolocation system. They do these little short yips that they use to locate and direct each other, and there's a very specific sound to when they're homing in on the prey, and they get much more excited, and then there are different sounds when they're communicating from a distance. So I always imagined the viper wolf sequence being sound driven up to a point where he holds the torch out and sees actually what he's dealing with, which is quite deep into the sequence. If you remember the sequence, they're kind of all around him. They're in the shadows. They're moving. They're yipping. They're communicating, and that was all based on coyotes. And you're 2 minutes into the sequence before you actually see what you're dealing with, this shiny six-legged thing that snarls at him in slow motion. So that was definitely thinking about the sound. So one of the first things Chris did when he came on was come up with sounds for the viper wolves.
Yeah, that was, and there's such a wide vocabulary there, because it's not just, the hunting nature of the coyotes that Jim described to us was something that we searched for, and ultimately recorded. Addison recorded them in his backyard as well as in Malibu, but there was also the hyena element that we found a research project up in the hills of UC Berkeley and recorded hyenas up there, and then I had to come up with this sort of cross between a ferocious canine and a ferocious large cat. And we kind of got it to where Jim was happy, and then we dove in deeper and deeper, and that was the way we often worked. We got to a place where Jim felt that we were starting to tell the story, and then he could sit down and start to really fine-tune it. And that's when it got really fun, because that's when we started to sort of peel back layers and find nuances that really spoke to the process.
Clarity.
Clarity is king.
Clarity is king.
That's the key word with you, isn't it? Clarity is.
I think you said that on Terminator.
Yeah,
Clarity
probably
is
you're
king.
consistent on that. But yeah, but I mean, we really strove for clarity and very, very articulate sound and yeah, and you know, I think that typically because there are so many good ideas feeding into at the pre-dub stage, you wind up with a lot of tracks, a lot of ways you can go. So I find it to be a reductive process of pulling layers away, making hard decisions in the moment. Let's feature that and forget about the rest of this. And sometimes pull out like 2 or 3 pre-dubs would come out.
Oh, yeah, or 5 or 6, yeah, easily. And a lot of times, you know, really against the grain of what we would do as sound editors, as sound designers, and you'd step back and go, wow, yeah, I mean, that completely cleared it out. Yeah, it's...
That's why, from Jim's perspective, as the storyteller, you know, sometimes we don't see those sounds or the specific things that are the narrative sounds, and that's what Jim would direct us to. It's like, that shot's in the film because of this, and these are the sounds I need to hear.
Right.
And
These are the 3 sounds I need to hear.
But you know, I mean, unfortunately, it sounds like we had an awful lot of time, but unfortunately, you know, I was like crazy every day working on the visual effects, and I really had very little time for Chris and his team until the last minute when it was like, okay, now we got to final dub the movie. I got no frickin' choice, and I was still working with the effects guys 12 hours a day, the visual effects guys.
Even then, your days were really limited to half days until
but
the
the point
very
was
end.
they
Sometimes
were
I
on
think
their
he didn't
own.
want to come in because he knew that it was going to be some work.
Yeah, but so you guys were on your own for a lot and created a lot of it yourselves, and so we were
had-
denied a basic kind of spotting cycle. You
But a
know,
lot
the
of times
way-
we had your temp though, which Jim would come in and we would
Yeah.
look at his temp mix, and he would, because it wasn't full, but there were those narrative sounds typically were
Yeah,
there.
it was all Chris and Addison's sounds. So
Right.
in a way, the cycle was, you know, Chris would propose all of the sound vocabulary. I'd just slap some of it into picture as a rough guide, which in a way stood in for the spotting session. And you might have been even on one of the other movies at that time, and I'm cutting the scene where Jake's fighting the Banshee or something, and I'm just slapping crap in there left and right fast, like the same sound effect used 12 times, you know. But then that would act as kind of a rough guide for where emphasis should be placed. Then Chris and his team would go in and use that as a rough guide, go back in and enunciate each one of those individual sound effects and give it a separate inflection and different character and all that. So it would come back all richer and you know, spatially, you know, work spatially so that it all, you know, so that it was, you know, it was elevated from a C to an A plus. And then we very quickly at the end, I think in the final dub, we worked pretty fast. I mean, we were finaling. Well, it sounds fast, but we were filing a reel a week. But it was really, we had a day a week to do it, because the other 5 or 6 days of the week I was working
Getting ready.
nonstop on the visual stuff.
We would get it to a place where we thought that the 3 of us sort of felt that we were in a good place to start working together. Then we would work together. Then Andy said, you know, okay, now let's listen to 100-foot sections. We'll listen to 100 feet of the temp, then we'll go back and listen to 100 feet of our final mix. And we would work back and forth in this very deliberate process until before we were ready to say, John, we're ready for Jim to come in and listen.
Or even you also had the editors would come in, the other 2 editors who worked
Right,
with Jim.
yeah. John
we would
and
have
Steve
Steve
would come
Rifkin
in.
and John Rafua come in, who had been living with the movie and the sound for so long, and they were then fresh ears
Right,
for these 3 to say, okay, here's what we're missing from the temp, and here's what we think Jim story-wise is
I
going.
never really had that before, but it was interesting. You know, they both had a really good ear, Rafua and Rifkin. Rifkin especially was particularly good with the music because he actually was a musician and had a music background. See, he wound up being kind of an ad hoc member of the mixing team and the music editing team in a funny way, just because he was so damn opinionated about it, and he had a lot of great ideas. And there were times when I was so stressed trying to finish the visual effects. We had 1,000 shots to finish in the last 6 weeks, so that was pretty crazed. And try to keep them up to the level of the whole picture. And so you know, Steve Rifkin came in and actually, you know, he would talk. I gave him, you know, sort of empowered him to talk directly to James, talk directly to the music mixers, talk directly to you guys, and it actually helped a lot. There was really a great, I think there was a great team spirit toward the end of the film, and a great collaborative spirit in that, you know, everybody was getting to have input into the final mix.
The thing that Chris and Andy and I realized early on, that because Jim was so busy and had so little time to spend with us, that we realized that we had to get the film, the sound into a shape where when he came in, it was all forward creative time. It wasn't time spent, you know, frustrated.
We would have arguments among ourselves, you know, whether we were really doing justice in that section.
Right.
Yeah, because I mean,
Kind
we
of a
would
triage. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say we would look at the temp in these small sections, and we would know that this wasn't it wasn't a question of mirroring it. It was just finding the intent of every moment, because clearly it was a very good roadmap. Right. So we'd have these discussions among ourselves and say, do you think that was really what do you think at this moment, was that meant to be like that? And we'd say, well, it's really an indication, so let's give it our best shot. And that's when Steve or Jon would come in, guide us a little further, and then when Jim would come in, hopefully we would that bit closer towards the.
Toward the end, I think the process got better when we began to understand that. Yeah,
Really got in sync toward the end. But I mean, for me, I had no choice. I looked at it as a kind of a triage decision. If a shot didn't look real visually, then the moment wouldn't be real. Sound, nobody's going to walk out of the theater because the sound doesn't sound real. You know what I mean? It's not. It's a different thing. Sound is all in support, but the picture you're looking at is going to make or break the moment in terms of the reality factor. You know, the sound can make it better. Although we found an interesting kind of psychoacoustic illusion, which is that when we'd have the mix all done in 2D, and when we'd go and play it in here and watch the picture in 3D, it sounded better.
Boy, did it ever. And that's just such a victory for us to come away. I mean, there were mornings we'd come in here and we'd be ready to roll at 7 o'clock, and we'd be so, you know, praying that it sounded good. And actually, the three of us had arguments, because I said, no, we got to come in and listen. We got to convince Jim to listen to it in the Zanuck away from the console. And these two would say, no, I don't think it's a good idea, because that room doesn't mimic our dub stage perfectly. And I said, no, we got to get the And Jon, thankfully, would say, yeah, Chris, I think, you know, the console.
This is why you don't get 3 Academy Award nominated mixers sitting at the same board.
Yeah, we're talking a lot about sound, and there's one thing that I just really want to emphasize that we're short shifting a little bit, which is the score that James Horner wrote, because that is such a part of the essence of the film, and it was a real challenge, because Jim challenged him to do something he had really never done, which is combine, you know, classic film scoring with indigenous and tribal music, and to make it feel of one piece.
Yeah, well, you know, look, James and I had a great history together between Aliens and Titanic, and I knew that he was going to do a spectacular job on this score. And we even temped a lot with some of his Apocalypto stuff, which was really based in a kind of an ethnomusicology approach to it, with a lot of indigenous instrumentation and vocal stuff and really creative stuff. And James wanted to push deeper that direction. He wanted to go way deep in the jungle and come up with a lot of really strange, you know, he kept coming back to me with these ideas of how alien we can make it. And I said, okay, I just want to caution you that I think we're going to have to do some kind of classic emotional scoring as well. And so I challenged him to find a blend. And ultimately what he did was he did some basic kind of, you know, epic, heroic, orchestral scoring with a lot of really powerful high brass writing that would play in almost a dynamic counterpoint to some of the moments that were done with ethnic percussion and some very obscure instruments, woodwind instruments that he had found, and some really interesting vocal textures that he had, he had been creating over years through Apocalypto, and even going as far back as Where the River Runs Black. And I had actually temped a couple of sequences with stuff from way back, 25 years earlier or longer, Where the River Runs Black, which is an Amazon film that took place in the Amazon rainforest. And so he blended this all together into something that felt consistent and thematically unified, and yet could build up to these huge, kind of muscular, sweeping, visual moments, and then telescope down to these moments in the rainforest with the Na'vi, where we sort of feel their heart and soul through the music.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. Now, before we wrap up, because it's almost 11 and we have to go, but I have to say and congratulate you that yesterday, when you received 9 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture, Best Director and everything, all you guys and everything else. Everybody up here is an Academy Award nominee and an Academy Award winner. You also passed your all-time domestic record. You passed Titanic yesterday as the biggest grossing movie in the history of movies domestic.
Quite a day. Is that for synchronicity?
What I think is really exciting about that is the potential it shows for the cinema experience. It's not just about Avatar, but to rekindle the belief of what all movies can do and draw people out of their homes in a day and age when home technology is getting better, and to prove that the cinema experience can still be magic. That's great.
Yeah, there's one. Yeah, he's right.
Amen.
On that same note, Avatar is now the highest grossing film. It's also the most pirated film in history. But if you think about what that means, it means that people are still selecting, making a decision to go to the cinema. When they can download it, they can get bootleg discs, they can do all that stuff, and they're doing it, and they're even watching it in that form, and then saying, I'm missing something. I need to go to the movies.
And they want to go because you've made a movie that takes people back to the cinema. I mean, I've heard this over and over from people saying, well, I can't wait for, Netflix on this. I've got to, see it in a theater. And then they'll decide, what format am I going to see it in? It's all that, which is really exciting. And it's also, I think, at its core, it's a great story. And it's about something, and people are really, you don't do this kind of business if there's not a there, if there's not something there. And you've gotten hit on the right and the left and all over the place on this, because it's got some
That's fun. It's
things
fun
to
that there's
say.
a dialogue around the movie, that there's something to talk about. But it's interesting that format selection has become the new kind of wine tasting. It's kind of like, well, I saw it in Dolby Digital, or I saw it in IMAX, or I saw it in IMAX Digital, and or I saw it in Real D Digital 3D, but now I've got to go see it in IMAX 3D. So it's become this kind of, there's almost like this snobbery around it, like cigars and tequila.
But I think you talk about, Jim has always put in his scripts what great writers do in their literature and science fiction, which is it's a metaphor for the world in which we live, and it asks us to beg questions about how we live our lives. And I think that's what Jim does in his writing that usually people reserve for longer form novels. And I think that's why this movie resonates.
Yeah, well, it's obviously resonated, and let's thank them for coming out here tonight. And this is fascinating. Thank you all. Good luck at the Oscars and all the other awards.
Thank you all for being here tonight.